Beneath the blazing sun's relentless heat, men and flocks are sweltering, pines are scorched. We hear the cuckoo's voice, then sweet songs of the turtle dove and finch are heard. Soft breezes stir the air, but threatening north wind sweeps them suddenly aside. The shepherd trembles, fearful of violent storm and what may lie ahead. It won't surprise you to learn that those words are from a poem, a sonnet, in fact. But it might surprise you to learn that the poet was the famous Italian Baroque composer Antonio Vivaldi. He wrote those lines to illuminate the first movement of one of his concertos, the concerto we're about to hear, of course. Now, these days, the Four Seasons is some of the best-known music ever written. We hear its pastoral strains in movies and recordings, and on commercials selling everything from floor polish to puppy chow. It would be easy to think that we've known and loved this music since it was written in the early 18th century, but that's not the case. Like so many composers of his time, Antonio Vivaldi did not write for posterity. He wrote music as a living, and was expected to keep writing new music to meet the demands of his daily life, which, in his case, was spent as the master of music at a school for foundling girls in Venice. He wrote a great deal of music, much of it concertos in the Baroque manner, in which a dominant instrument or small group of instruments traded off thematic material with a larger string ensemble. We know of hundreds of such works written by Vivaldi, but we likely don't know of many more, because Vivaldi himself didn't really expect that these works had anything like a shelf life. He'd write one for a specific concert, perhaps with a specific performer in mind, one of his more gifted students more than likely, and then move on to write the next and the next. Every so often, Vivaldi would collect a few concertos and have the sheet music published. A set of 6 or 12 concertos would be published as a volume, and like as not, the volume would be given a catchy name. One was called Extravagance. Another was called La Cetra, which was the name for a lyre-like instrument that the emperor was quite fond of. He published 12 concertos as his opus number 8, and while the entire set was called The Contest Between Harmony and Invention, it was his further subdivision of the first 4 concertos of that set that now stand out to us. The first 4 concertos were named after and inspired by each of the 4 seasons of the year. For each of the concertos, Vivaldi wrote a separate sonnet. Now, these sonnets, while certainly not the rival of Shakespeare for their poetry, are nevertheless remarkable in the role they play in bringing to life, in the music, actual life, nature, the countryside. The Four Seasons, therefore, are one of the earliest examples of what we now call program music. Now, let's go back to what I said earlier. Vivaldi was a music-making machine. The old joke about him was that he wrote not 450 violin concertos, but that he wrote one concerto 450 times. Write it, play it, move on. It's truly remarkable that he wrote such beautiful music, given how quickly he had to churn them out, and how disposable he must himself have thought them to be. It makes us wonder what it was specifically that made him choose to bring nature to life so vividly in these 4 works. Many, if not most, pieces of instrumental music composed in the Western art tradition that we call classical music are works of absolute music. Beethoven's 7th Symphony in A major is perfectly named because it is exactly that. The 7th Symphony he composed, one that is based squarely in the tonic key of A major or other key signatures which complement it for various artistic reasons, and it is not meant to be anything other than the music. Now, program music, by contrast, is music which has an extra-musical association. Mendelssohn evokes the rough waters and the weather-beaten Scottish coast in his Hebrides Overture. Richard Strauss was so inspired by a philosophical book by Nietzsche that he wrote a symphonic poem based on his impressions of it. And Haydn jocularly hinted to his employer that his musicians were due for a vacation with his Farewell Symphony. All of these pieces written much, much later than Vivaldi's. But Vivaldi went even one step further with the Four Seasons. Each concerto is not only inspired by a season of the year, we hear aspects of each season imitated by instruments of the orchestra, a kind of musical onomatopoeia. In the second movement of tonight's piece, for example, Vivaldi's sonnet says of the shepherd, "His limbs are now awakened from their repose by fear of lightning's flash and thunder's roar, as gnats and flies buzz furiously around. Listen for those annoying insects buzzing about in the orchestra," in the second movement. In the final movement, Vivaldi writes, "Alas, his worst fears were justified, as the heavens roar and great hailstones beat down upon the proudly standing corn." We hear one of music's first imitations of a storm, an aspect many composers have taken up over the years. Think of Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony or the terrific shipwreck in the storm from Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade. Not a bad legacy for four throwaway works that their creator could not have imagined outliving him, especially to become such familiar favorites. And yet it was really only with the advent of recording in the early 20th century that Vivaldi's Four Seasons became so widely known. Each concerto is about a dozen minutes long, just enough to cram onto a 78 RPM phonograph record, and a perfect bite-sized chunk of music for radio broadcast. Some of the great violinists of the early days of recording helped popularize the pieces, and today there are hundreds of recordings available. Over the last couple of seasons, the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra's concertmaster, Robert Uchida, has championed performances of the works as they would have been played in Vivaldi's time, led from the first violin. We are thrilled to have him once again lead the music of Summer, the second of Vivaldi's Four Seasons.